So the technology we've been working on is called epigenetic reprogramming. Basically, we're changing which genes from the genome that cells can use. And we believe that there's actually a way to manipulate aged cells to use the same genes they did when they were younger and restore youthful function.
Assuming when you started this business, you weren't thinking, wow, huge opportunity in this space of epigenetic reprogramming because of everything happening with AI.
So being able to search these big combinatorial spaces using AI systems, I think is going to be one of the most impactful verticals where these systems actually start to create value in the economy. If you can help discover even just a few impactful drugs, each one of those drugs has the same economics as a large software business.
Let's go back to fundraising. You don't come out of the gate raising 5 million like most software companies and then raising 20 and then 50. This is like a few $100 million to start.
It took probably $5 million just to get a basic version of our laboratory built out and to de-risk some of these basic technological questions that we were trying to go after.
Is there any chance that you discover nothing here? Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today. I am super excited to talk all things aging, as it is a very hot topic right now. And NewLimit, which you co-founded, I think in March of 2022, has been off to the races. So I would love to hear the origin story. I know you started this with two co-founders, Blake Byers, who was previously at GV and did a ton in biotech, and then Brian Armstrong, who also co-founded Coinbase. But what on earth were you doing before, and how did you meet those guys?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to get to connect with you and to get to share the story of the company. So really the origin of NewLimit came from the science, from the discoveries, as opposed to from the side of just building a company and then trying to find a problem. It was really a technology that emerged and got all three of us co-founders excited that really led us to believe founding a company was really the best way to take action upon it. So the technology we've been working on is called epigenetic reprogramming. Basically, we're changing which genes from the genome that cells can use. And we believe that there's actually a way to manipulate aged cells to use the same genes they did when they were younger and restore youthful function. So a bit of how the band came together. I was working on some of this science, leading a group at a company called Calico, which some folks might know as the longevity biotech inside of Google.
Okay.
If you read the abc.xyz blog post many years ago, it went something like, we finally have to do this alphabet holding company because the aging bet was finally weird enough that our shareholders wanted us to break it out somehow. Yeah. So I ran a group there working on this same science, and really these were the strongest results I had ever seen. There are a lot of experiments you run in biology where you have some intervention, you're hoping it rescues function in an aged or disease setting, and you're crossing your fingers and you just don't see the effects are that large. And this was the opposite. I actually went in really skeptical, and by contrast, the results were far more impactful than I ever expected. You really could make aged cells express younger genes and even start to function like younger ones. Around the same time, my co-founders Blake and Brian, who you mentioned, were seeing some of these results that were popping up in a few labs around the world and getting excited about the same idea. Brian in particular, I think, is really passionate about trying to push the frontier of technology to pull the future forward by a few years. And he saw this as one of the opportunities where, with the right group of people and the right capital strategy, you could actually maybe make medicines in a decade rather than a century based on this technology. So I was lucky enough to get connected with my co-founders through some mutual friends. It turns out the Bay Area is not that large. It's still somehow a village. So we were all only one hop away. They were interested in the topic. I was working on the topic. We got to talking. And it was pretty clear from even our first conversations that all of us were thinking about building a company here. And so selfishly, rather than compete with my co-founders, both of whom are very intimidating experts in their own domains, I felt it would be better if we built the company together. So that's really how we came together and how the company got started.
Yeah. In terms of it getting started, how did you know where to start and how has that evolved? Like, we're going to dive into some of the latest on metabolism and liver and all of that, but this is just a wide ocean of opportunities. So from when you started in 2022 and the path you were going down, has that evolved, or did you come into this knowing exactly where you were starting and going to expand?
I wish we knew everything on day one. It would have been a lot easier had we known that. I think the way we laid it out was we tried to think about what are the eventual products we would like to make and then work backwards from that. So imagine you have the ability by delivering just a few genes in the form of RNAs to turn on these very special genes in the genome called transcription factors and make an old cell act like a young one to actually restore some of its youthful functions. Well, let's sort of think through the constraints we have today. We can probably only do that for 1 or 2 cell types at a time with some of the existing medicines we have. What would be the cell types that would be most impactful? What would be the problems that might arise along the way? And so you can write down for yourself a list of the risks in the business. And what we knew starting out was that one of the challenges we were going to have was simply technological. It was more of an engineering challenge even than a biological one, which is we're trying to deliver these groups of genes called transcription factors. And we know that these groups kind of work like jazz bands. They actually function based on their interactions as much as their additive terms. And that means that even just taking one gene in or out can make the group act totally different. The same way you add Thelonious Monk to a band, you take him away, and the band sounds totally different, even though it's mostly the same people. And so the search space then of these combinations is so huge. You're just never going to be able to do all the experiments. You can't just go into a lab and brute force test them all. So we had a bunch of technical risks in the early days of can we build the right technologies not only to do a large number of these experiments using some genomic tools, but can we build artificial intelligence systems that help predict which of these combinations will have the effects we want? And can that work? Can we actually find the combinations that make an old cell act young in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable investment? So we knew that was really problem number 1. And then problems number 2 and 3 were once you find those combinations, how do we actually turn that into a medicine? How do we actually get those genes into a human cells? And so thinking through the technology there, that helps you limit which groups of cells you go after. And the final question is, once I have that medicine, how would I actually show that it works in people? What would a trial look like? Yeah. When you line up all of those different risks and think about working through them one by one, the space of the best opportunities actually narrows a lot. And so a few of the things we thought about doing after establishing the technology were restoring function in the liver, which is conveniently a tissue that's really easy to deliver genes to for some natural reasons we can get into. And then the immune system, where you have cells swimming around in your blood, likewise comparatively easy to get genes into them, and they have a role in just about every tissue in your body. So if you could fix it, if you could fix your liver, it's so critical to all of your metabolism, it would have a really big impact. If you could fix your immune system, so critical it has a big impact. And so even from the first days, once we had de-risked the technology, I think those sorts of targets of the products we want to make did reveal themselves relatively readily.
Yeah, going back to the AI piece, right? So when you were getting started, I know like early entry to LLMs, let's say, so I'm assuming when you started this business, you weren't thinking, wow, huge opportunity in this space of epigenetic reprogramming because of everything happening with AI. But I imagine that's only created tailwinds to your point. What do you think the larger opportunities are now looking forward with like AI capabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us in particular, the thing that we've really benefited from is that folks have started to build foundational models of biological languages the same way we build them for human languages. So in this exact same way you can take an LLM and train it to speak English or French or Spanish, you can treat the sequences of proteins and the sequences of DNA just like a human language and train a model much the same way. And what this means is that when we try and predict the outcome of one of our experiments that we haven't done yet, basically the form of that experiment is pretty simple. I have some number of these genes that I'm going to put into an old cell, and I want to know what that old cell will look like after this is done. Well, one of the foundational challenges in actually building this model is you have to say, how do I represent these genes to my model? I could give it the name of the gene, but then I would kind of have to learn all of the biology from scratch. Instead, because we can use these foundational models to actually embed these genes first, in the same way you would embed a document with an LLM, you can embed a gene using a protein language model and a DNA language model. These models get to start from really smart places. So in a way, what we're doing is fine-tuning a smaller model on top of these big foundational models that already exist and have emerged due to these AI tailwinds that are coming behind us. And that's allowed us to make just tremendous progress. Yeah. We found that if we try to learn all of biology from scratch, absent those foundational models, things work, but not quite as well. Whereas by contrast, when we're building on top of those models, we're actually able to explain about half of all the variation that occurs in our experiments before we ever do them. So that's not nearly good enough to like never go back to the lab. I'm not going to claim that we can do this all in silico today, but it's way, way better than what we would be able to predict if it was just me writing down my guesses on a whiteboard. And that means that we're way better at designing experiments because I don't design them anymore. The intelligence system does. So that's been huge for us. And in a way, I think what we're working on is a special case of a more general problem in drug discovery. In drug discovery, the first question you have to ask is, what is the target biology I'm trying to manipulate in a patient? If I want to take a person who is sick and I want to make them healthy again, or I want to keep a healthy person healthy longer, what are the genes I want to manipulate in which cells? It turns out for the vast majority of people with the vast majority of health conditions, we just don't know what to manipulate. And so part of the challenge is that most biology involves combinations of genes, and the number of combinations is astronomical. So being able to search these big combinatorial spaces using AI systems, I think is going to be one of the most impactful verticals where these systems actually start to create value in the economy. If you can help discover even just a few impactful drugs, each one of those drugs has the same economics as a large software business. There are more drugs than there are software businesses doing $1 billion a year, and there are individual drugs worth $1 trillion. Yeah. And so I really see this as one of the areas where not only are you going to build some great AI businesses, but also an area where we're just going to have tremendous positive ramifications for humanity. Yeah. It's easy to get excited about making new medicines that help people stay healthy.
Yeah. If you could break it down for me as someone who I'm a new student to this space, what are the maybe like top handful of things that you think people would want to take medicine for, that like because they're like, is it Alzheimer's? Is it like, what are the most common things that happen to you at old age that you're like, if we could just create medicine for this, like, is there a direct map to maybe the top key things that like go wrong as we get older that you're like, these are our targets, or is it still a bit unknown?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way to work backwards is to say, well, what are the diseases that unfortunately kill people later in their lives? And you can sort of just walk down that list. And then another way to frame it, which is a bit more unique to trying to keep people healthy longer rather than only treating them when they're very sick, is to ask, what are the challenges that occur in all of our bodies that most of us over, let's call it 25, have experienced some degree of, that we would love to be able to forestall? And those lists overlap but aren't perfectly aligned. And so I like to think about the big categories as things like energy and metabolism. I personally, when I was 20 years old, felt a lot different when I woke up in the morning or after I had a large meal or had a glass of wine than I do today. And that's largely a result of a decline in your metabolic function. Another would be your cardiovascular system and its integration with some of your renal functions, your kidneys. Yeah. This is the number one killer, and it also influences a lot of the qualitative features of, again, how you feel from an energy perspective, that it's difficult to measure, but easy to describe to another person. You highlighted a couple others. These are things like mobility. Your skeletal muscle system, unfortunately, starts to decline. No matter how many reps of a curl bar you do when you're 80 years old, you can't build muscle mass anymore. It's called sarcopenia, which is a fancy Greek word for muscle gets small. It's literally what it means. Biologists love to use Greek to describe very simple concepts. And then a final might be something like cognitive decline, where for a number of reasons, not only within your brain, but some of the cells that surround it, unfortunately we find that our fluid intelligence declines in the later decades of our lives. And even folks who aren't succumbing to a very pronounced disorder like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's still experience this. It penetrates to almost everyone. And so if you think about those as the major problems that arise with age, not only that take our lives in the end, but make our lives less fulfilling in the decades leading up to that point, then those are the types of problems you'd want to solve with some of these major classes of medicines. So we're thinking about, for instance, for metabolism, being able to make your liver function like a younger version. We think that would go a lot of the way toward not only keeping people healthier longer in very measurable ways in a clinic that your doctor would appreciate, but also help you feel younger in a way that you would appreciate and would motivate you to use medicine like this. So we do think about these as, ultimately the problems that arise in people's lives are the markets for therapeutics technologies. And so you can work backwards from what are the things the patients would most want to what are the drugs that would be most valuable to build. Yep. And you then have to do the intersection with, well, which of those are possible today? And we'd like to argue that while not all of them are tractable, a subset are, and that if you're able to be successful here, these are some of the most valuable products you could imagine. If you had a drug that made everyone feel like their metabolism was a decade younger, every single person would want it, right? So you have no market risk, all scientific and technical risk. Can I make the thing? If I can, I know that this will be a great product. Yeah.
So less about, I remember it at the first progress update. I think I said this to Blake, but I was like, what if I don't want to live forever? And the response is, what if you could live better for as long as you live? And which is totally fair. I'm 35 now and aging quickly, and I feel it now. No, super interesting. So for those of us who aren't, students of biotech and don't really understand maybe the business model for this, so is the idea, and I saw that Eli Lilly came in with a strategic round more recently, which is wonderful, is the idea that how does this work? So you create the medicines and then you distribute through like an Eli Lilly, or how does that work exactly for those of us that don't know?
Yeah, sure. So the typical life cycle of a medicine would be that you have something called discovery, where initially you create the first instantiation of the molecule that you might put in a patient. That typically happens in a research lab. Today, about 70% of drugs that are actually going into clinical trials were discovered by pretty small biotech startups. So this is really the innovation engine of the ecosystem. If a new medicine is going to benefit you or someone in your family, it probably comes from a startup, actually, not a huge company in its origin story. Then there's a phase called development, where you need to actually run human clinical studies. Effectively, you give the drug to people and you measure some things in the clinic and you try and figure out whether or not it's helping them. The basic bar there is just that it's safe, so obviously don't do any harm, and then effective, meaning this person feels better, or they survive better, or they function better in some way. Then the final piece of how you actually go about making money is what we'd call commercialization. So once the medicine's approved, that doesn't mean people instantly start taking it. You need to actually work with providers so that they understand and recognize when this medicine can be beneficial, which patients this might help, so they can prescribe it to folks at the appropriate time. And so there are basically two ways to go about this. One you mentioned, which is very common for small biotechs like ours, is to partner with an existing pharmaceutical firm that has this great go-to-market function built out. If you think about how complicated the healthcare system is, especially in the United States and parts of Western Europe, it's amazing that anyone has managed to build a go-to-market function. And so some of these pharmaceutical firms, I think, must have some of the most sophisticated sales forces that you could imagine. And so it's really beneficial often for a small biotech to partner with one of these firms so that rather than trying to relearn how to do sales from scratch, you can focus on the R&D that you're best at. You also, at a certain stage, can do what we call full integration, and you can go commercial yourself. And so the story of how a biotech might evolve, you can maybe encapsulate with one of the businesses we admire. Is a company called Genentech, really got the industry started here in the Bay Area. Anyone who's been to San Francisco, you drive past it on the way up from the airport. So the way they did this was their very first medicine. They partnered with Eli Lilly. That was Humulin, so the first human insulin, so people weren't allergic to it.
Oh,
and then a few medicines later, they actually built out their own sales force once they had a revenue stream and they could afford to invest in these sorts of things. So I think that's the model that most companies are aspiring to. Maybe your first medicine, you partner it, and the larger partner will get some of the revenues as part of a royalty share. And then hopefully, if you're successful, you eventually are able to take your own medicine commercially yourself.
Super interesting. It sounds like what's next up for you, but it still might take a few years, is that, and I know you mentioned the latest PR for fundraising, is that you're closer to trials. So what does close mean?
Yeah, sure. So typically in the discovery stage, I collapsed a whole bunch of things into one bucket of stuff that happens in a lab. The first thing you have to do is figure out what are the targets, the pieces of biology I'm trying to manipulate to help this patient. So that's often called target discovery, or we call it payload discovery because we're thinking about multiple genes we might co-deliver. So you work through that, then you need to validate that you found the right ones. Maybe you tested 10,000 of them in kind of a high throughput, low fidelity scheme. Then you got 10 exciting ones. You try and then compete those off against one another and figure out which is best. You then would want to test it in some animal model, the best animal models of the disease you have available usually, see if it's actually effective. From that point on, you do what we call lead optimization, which is you try and take that molecule and make the very best version of it possible. One analogy I like to use for software folks is that biotech is kind of like in the era of Microsoft shipping Windows on disks. Once you ship it, you can't actually send an update. The next update is a totally new drug. And so you need to get the very best version that you can built before you would ever start later stage development. So the reason I walk you through that story is NewLimit today is about to finish our first lead optimization campaign. Wow. At that stage, what you have is called a preclinical candidate. So this is basically a molecule you're hoping to eventually put in a human, and you run it through a bunch of very rigid animal studies, largely. These prove that it's safe and effective. So it includes things like not only testing this drug in mice, but testing it in larger animals, like maybe pigs. If pigs are a good model of your disease, they're a little bit closer to humans than mice are, just by virtue of size. And then a number of other efficacy and safety work, pieces of safety work you would do. You then have to show you can manufacture it at scale. You have to be able to convince FDA that if you start a trial, your patients aren't going to get halfway into the trial and you're stuck wandering around outside trying to figure out how to make your drug. So there's a whole bunch of work that goes into it. That's what the part of it that we'll be doing for the next couple of years. It takes a while because some of these safety studies that sound a little bit crazy when you say they take 2 years on the face are pretty reasonable when you dig into it. If you want to make sure your medicine doesn't cause neoplasia, i.e. doesn't cause cancer, the best way we know to do that today is just to put it in an animal and wait a long time and make sure nothing bad happens. And so, while it seems slow, when you think through it from the perspective of what would I want to do before a member of my family took this, it's actually more reasonable. Yeah. From there, we go into clinical studies. And that's really the first time you break that out into 3 phases. The first phase, you just prove it's safe, called phase 1. You give it to some people who are otherwise healthy, make sure nothing bad happens. Phase 2, you put it into sick patients for the first time, see if it can actually help them get healthier or stay healthy longer. And the final phase is basically you do the phase 2, but with lots more people. You really confirm the result is true.
Yeah.
And that's at the point at which you start thinking about selling it. So for us, when we say we're close, we're at the point where we almost have the final vial in hand we want to put into animals. We then just kind of start a clock where we're running through a series of pretty standard steps. And our hope would be that the output of that, we could get into patients in just a couple of years.
That's super interesting. In going back, I know you obviously started the team with 2 co-founders, so 3 of you, but what was the initial team and, how has it grown over time? Like, and is it, that's the first question.
Yeah. So the initial team was just us on a Zoom call. So, it certainly has gotten better over time. So for the first year or so, we only had 5 or 6 scientists, a couple really brave members of our team today who I'm grateful to for ever joining a crazy startup that was trying something new that hadn't been de-risked at all when our office looked terrible and there was no one around to talk to. So for the first year, it was really small. We unlocked a few of the technical risks over that period. We grew to about 30 over the course of the following year and a half. So by biotech standards, actually, we're still very small and scrappy. And today we're only about 40 people, even 3 years in. So we're still a very small team. We're big believers in the idea that having the right people with more time and more shots on goal and resources behind them is often more efficient than having a bigger team where that team has less resources to work with, whether those be dollars to spend or days on the calendar of runway where they can actually make choices.
When you think about AI, for example, there's really only, I think, like top 1,000 researchers in AI. In your world, what is the pool of incredibly smart people that can work on this?
It's probably of a similar size. It is a very small pool of really talented scientists. And the niches we work in are even heterogeneous within the company. I'll just give you 2 examples. The very first step of this process where we're trying to figure out what genes do I want to turn on to try and help these old cells act like young ones, that's a field known as functional genomics. We're using genomic tools to run thousands of experiments at the same time and then figure out what happened in each of them by sequencing these DNA barcodes and figuring out what each perturbation did. There are probably only 20 great labs in the world that train people to do this, and each one might produce a few trainees per year. And so we're looking at just hundreds of people in that subfield who I think are really at the frontier of the science where they can help push it forward. And I think we're very lucky to have recruited many of them from these top groups. But it very much mirrors AI in that way, where I feel like now in the Valley, every venture capitalist knows the top ML labs. They all know they want a Bengio student, right?
Yeah.
It's funny thinking back 10 years ago at NeurIPS, I never thought the entire venture community would know who these folks were. It's very similar in bio. And then by contrast, where I think maybe this diverges a bit from AI, where there's a similar talent pool that's applicable across many problems, the talent pool for us or in other biotechs that might, for instance, be able to discover those genes and then turn them into a medicine is pretty different. So the number of groups that have made an RNA medicine is similarly small, but almost non-overlapping with the people who discover the genes that you want to go drug anyway. So I think from a talent perspective, it's got to be one of the harder problems to work through in terms of sourcing and finding this talent. And I give our head of talent, Alex Kim, a whole lot of credit for working through these challenging problems. It's like doing the usual talent function of a startup on hard mode.
Do you think realistically, with that said, could you have maybe 100-person company and hit commercialization?
I think that's feasible. Yeah. There are many biotechs which have done commercialization through a partner under 100 people. And so I think that's an entirely reasonable approach to take. I think we would opt to try and stay small as long as possible for those efficiency reasons. So that's the type of objective we see as a positive destination rather than a failure mode. I often think the reason these companies get large has less to do with necessity and more to do with a lack of patience or a lack of willingness to say no to some of the good ideas that arise. One of my mentors used to say to me that, running a biotech well is saying no to good ideas every day because there's just more ideas than you can pursue. And I think it's hard to do that. And so if you're able to maintain the discipline, then you could arrive at that destination where you've created immense value with a relatively small number of people.
Well, it's a good question for you because this is your first time really running a business. Has that been an interesting challenge, or do you feel like you didn't start really staffing the team until you had that focus and that lane that you really thought like, okay, here's what we're going to be working on for the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's definitely been challenging. I mean, there are moments almost every week where you think, oh my gosh, this problem would be so much easier if I could just hire N people to try and go solve it for us. And usually for the local decision of that one problem, that would be the right decision if that were the only objective function you had to consider at the time. And it's really only when you think about the business more globally and you ask yourself, well, if we add more people here, would we also have to add people in some other team in order to balance that out? Would then the burn rate we're operating at get to a point where it doesn't give us the time we need to get the right number of decisions made in the interim? It's really only at that global level that I think you can appreciate why staying small is an advantage rather than a disadvantage. And so it's a constant challenge. And I know there are times where I've probably erred on the wrong end of that spectrum, both building a little bit too quickly in an area or not building rapidly enough and then having to try and catch up over the sort of incipient months. But I think overall we've done a reasonable job of staying on track in terms of ensuring we can get a lot done with a small group of people. And what you find is there are other superpowers that are just hard to quantify. When you're a small company, everyone can communicate with everyone else really readily. It doesn't matter how smart you are, n squared is just n squared. And so there's no way you can sort of work your way around losing that superpower if you get larger.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go back to fundraising. I know that all of you as co-founders put in quite a bit of capital into this to get it going. I think it's the 9 figures, based on the press. In terms of what it takes to get this to commercialization, but maybe let's start with when you first started NewLimit, and Biotech's been a space for a long time and it's been venture backed, but how hard was it, and maybe compared to now where it seems like you've just kind of raised a ton since founding, is it from a fundraising perspective, like maybe even frame the CapEx requirements for this, because you don't come out of the gate raising 5 million like most software companies and then raising 20 and then 50. This is like a few $100 million to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you alluded to, my co-founders, Brian and Blake, committed $110 million of their own personal capital to the business over its lifetime at the outset. And so I think that was hugely enabling for us in order to get an ambitious idea like this off the ground. And I think not only is it something that I think is a testament to their foresight and willingness to take risk, but also just to the technology that can be unlocked by having differentiated sources of capital that are optimizing on different timescales. Your timescale can be alpha by being more patient than other pieces of capital. And so we probably would not have been able to build this business, as you said, like a software business, just raising $5 million and then trying to get to the next milestone. It took probably $5 million just to get a basic version of our laboratory built out and to de-risk some of these basic technological questions that we were trying to go after. Now, I think that risk is commensurately rewarded in terms of the potential upside here, where if we are able to be successful, the potential value of the medicines we're creating is so massive that even given the upfront risks, the Sharpe ratio can look really attractive. And so maybe to tell the story of how we managed to capitalize the business, both my co-founders' commitment early on, and then we were very fortunate to have some really great capital partners join us, even just in the early days of the company. We raised a Series A not that long after founding, and credit forever to our investors, Dimension Capital, Founders Fund, Kleiner Perkins, who were willing to make a bet on the people and the opportunity space, even before we had a lot of that technical foundation to be able to back it. And over the incipient years, as we've been able to demonstrate that we could actually reduce that plan to practice and make a lot of progress, going from just an idea to having prototype medicines that work in animals, raising capital has become, I don't want to say easier, but it's a very different type of motion. We're now actually selling the results and a stake in those results as opposed to just the reputations of the great people behind it.
Yeah. Is it common in your world? I had never been invited to a progress update in person for a company before. So was that just an idea to keep investors and even potential talent up to speed, get them excited, and say, was that just a strategic decision, or is that common in biotech?
Not common at all. It's the weirdest thing we do.
Is it really?
It's like a super...
I enjoyed it. 80% went over my head and 20% landed. And it was
thank
perfect.
you so much for coming. It means a lot to us. No, it's a super weird thing to do.
Okay.
And all credit to my co-founder, Brian, for this. When he first told me that this was something he wanted to do with the company, I thought, this is really strange. No one's going to show up. It's going to be like a birthday party where none of your friends come. It's going to be weird. And by contrast, I think it's actually been a superpower for the company, not only through the progress update, but through public blogs that we post, to be a lot more open about what we're doing. There's this meme in biotech of building in stealth, which I've never really understood, because the problem with a startup, when you first start it, I know from experience, is that no one cares about your company. The problem you most often encounter is you go to talk to a candidate and they're like, who are you and what are you doing? Rather than trying to steal your secrets that you haven't even necessarily made yet. And so I think we tried to address that by taking just the polar opposite view, that if we're as open as we can be without revealing core IP about what we're working on, then it can become a magnet for great talent to want to come to the company. Because even from far away, they can start to get a sense of what it might be like to work here, what it might be like to be a part of this team. And that's an advantage when they're considering multiple opportunities and all the other opportunities are shrouded in mystery. If you have a great idea that you'd enjoy NewLimit and not a great sense of what it would be like at companies B or C, potentially we're able to win on the margin for the really essential scientists we need. I think it's also been helpful to market the company more broadly and allow us to develop some positive sentiment even within the investing community and folks who don't otherwise have access to understand a company like a biotech and how it's built. I think biotechs are generally pretty bad at communicating their science. We adapt a lot of our culture from academia, where the more esoteric you can make the thing that you're describing sound, the more difficult you can make it to understand by wrapping it in technical language, the smarter you must be. And I think actually the opposite is true. It takes really bright people to make stuff simple. And so it's given us an opportunity to try and make the company more legible, more broadly. And so I think that, again, not only has been to our benefit with talent and potentially in allowing investors to understand what the company is doing as well, but I also think is to some degree a bit of a moral imperative. I think the science we're working on is potentially very important for society, and that there's value in allowing even just the average person on the street to understand how it's progressing and how they might contribute. Yeah.
Would you say, I mean, you still have to go through trials, there's so much work to be done, but do you think that and you'll just die trying, is there any chance that you discover nothing here, that things don't end up making it past animals, and then is there still a really real chance that this never goes to commercialization? And I'm assuming it's similar to a startup from the pre-seed or seed stage. There's a 90+% failure rate. I mean, is it or do you feel like it's de-risked? Investors don't listen to this part, but is there where do you?
Anyone in this business needs to be honest that most drugs you put into trials don't work. Yeah. And so if you step back from many, many feet and ask, why does that often happen? The challenge is that it's really hard to know what will happen in a complex human body when you put a medicine into it based only on what happens in other systems, human cells in a dish, animals that are running around in tiny cages. And so no matter how excited you may be preclinically, you need to maintain a degree of sobriety around the fact that no singular medicine is going to necessarily work out. So there's a chance that the medicines we're building won't work either. And that's difficult to say, obviously. I'd love to tell you that we have some certain proof that that's true, but it would just be leading you down the wrong path. Now, what I think a company like ours can do to try and reduce those risks is to amortize them across a portfolio of bets. If you know that you have a bet which has really high expected value, if this drug does work, it's worth a ton to the business and to society, but there's some volatility here, there's a chance it fails, then the way to actually reduce the volatility of your high EV bets is to stick more of them in the bag and to aggregate them. And so I think something we've thought about from the very beginnings of the company is how to diversify the sources of risk that we are taking. Not unlike building an investment portfolio, if you can ensure that those risks are uncorrelated, then the value of the total portfolio is increased. So we think that some of the risks that we might encounter in the clinic are inherent to certain types of biology. There might be something about human livers that's just really hard to model in animals. And there might be something about human immune systems that's really hard to model in animals, or human endothelial cells. But if we take bets in each one of those verticals, then the chances that all of them fail is substantially lower than any one. So that's how we've thought about it today. There's a chance that any one of these medicines might fail, but our hope is that by taking multiple shots on goal, making bets that have some uncorrelated risks, that you're able to get to a place where the expected value of that bag and even the volatility associated with it is really favorable as an investment opportunity.
It's really interesting. Pulling yourself out of NewLimit and just looking at the overall market right now of so many things going on, hopefully impacting people's health in a great way. There's so much going on in the world. do you is there anything you're really excited about that you're seeing in parallel that ultimately ends up impacting aging in a good way? Whether it's I'm seeing some data on GLP-1s and that's been all the craze. So is that something that's interesting? I'm seeing a ton with genetics, and the more we can learn about ourselves, the more we can potentially start taking medicines earlier that hopefully will exist. Is there any other parallel universe aside from NewLimit on the aging front right now that you're seeing great momentum that you're just personally really excited about?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll maybe break this into 3 buckets, and 2 of them you already mentioned.
Yeah.
One, I think the incretin mimetics broadly, these are the GLP-1 medicines, the GIP-1 agonists, tirzepatide, Ozempic, most folks have heard of these. I think of these are probably one of the first few longevity medicines that exist in the ecosystem, meaning that the median American can expect that they will have more healthy years in their lives as a result of these medicines existing than prior to them being broadly accessible. And I think that is really the first existence proof that most folks will see for themselves as consumers, where there are some benefits to this medicine that you directly would like to have in your life that provide not only additional years of health, but higher quality life during that time. It's one of the first medicines we've seen where it's really the individuals driving the demand rather than just the prescribers.
Interesting.
And so I think those are really, but not only going to be an amazing medicine in and of themselves, but help serve as a proof point for this entire category of medicines that might have some amount of inherent consumer demand and can help keep people healthier longer rather than just try and treat them once they're already very sick. So we really think about those as the eidolon of the type of drug we'd love to be able to make at NewLimit. The second piece of this that I'm excited about is more broadly the broader accessibility of diagnostics and the ability to quantify your own health more rigorously. From the sort of company perspective, you have firms like Prenuvo and Superpower and Function Health, and many people.
Max was just in here Tuesday.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, yeah. It's from Superpower, so we've got that episode coming up. But yeah.
Great. Okay, tune back to that one. Jump back to it later. Firms like this, and I think, are giving people the ability to understand their own bodies more in depth than they ever have. Even things like the Oura Ring that give you the ability to have more quantification of how healthy you are. And I think those combined with some of these medicines that are really designed for everyone to keep you healthier longer might give you not only the desire to have that health, but the ability to measure it and see the value in your own life and then build that recurring habit of maintaining your own health over time. And so I think the sort of parallel verticals of the therapeutics coming online at the same time that you have the diagnostics and the measurement technologies to see the impact in your own body is a really interesting interplay that I think will drive demand on both sides there. And then the final piece of this is maybe just in the early discovery portion of where these medicines come from. You already alluded to this earlier, but AI is going to have a big impact on drug discovery, to my mind. There are, I think, 3 big problems in trying to make new drugs today. We don't know what genes to target, so we're bad at target discovery. We're bad at getting those genes into cells or manipulating the genes in the right cells in your body, so delivery. And then we don't collect that much data in humans. And it turns out just figuring out what happens in humans is really challenging. And I think AI provides a big unlock for each piece of this. We're starting to see versions of this on target discovery with not only companies like our own, but many others in the ecosystem I admire. We've got versions of it working on delivery. And then I think we're starting to see the earliest glimmers where we can extrapolate from the small amounts of human data we do get from clinical trials to design better ones going forward. And so that's the third bucket that I'm really excited about. I think AI will act as an enabling technology across the 3 real big meaty problems in drug discovery, and potentially allow us to get more medicines per dollar invested for the first time in almost a century. Unfortunately, that number's been going in the wrong direction for a long time.
Super interesting. Well, Jacob, thank you so much. Last piece, if folks want to get in touch with you, they want to work with NewLimit, contribute in some way, or just chat, in case you have time, how should they get in touch?
You can just Google my name. I should come up.
Okay.
I'm on Twitter, too much. You can ping me there. Always happy to talk about science, coffee shops, random conspiracy theories.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole.